Okay, guys, I'm gonna do another Cameron's Corner. I left off talking about. Here, I'll change my my view. I left off talking about the pre-creation state. So here at the top of the, I'll do it over here. At the top there, where it says pre-creation, in Genesis 1 verse 2, if you remember, let me just go there. I gotta switch over to the books here. Go back to Genesis 1 verse 2, right? If you remember, there are three things mentioned in verse 2. It says the earth was without form and void, okay, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And what I said was, what I was getting at was that there are three kind of basic things here. The earth is formless, and it's empty. That's void is like a fancy way of saying empty. And what the image here is that it's a giant ocean, a deep waters, they're deep waters. And this waters represent or are symbolic of the elements, the chaos from which God will create the world. On the face of the deep, on the face of the waters, is darkness. And then there's also the Spirit of God moving upon the face of the waters. And so those are the three things that are going to, God is going to use to create the earth. And the rest of this story here in Genesis chapter 1 will describe that process, okay? Right now, what I'm doing, if you remember, is I'm building out a typology of what water represents, what it symbolizes, and then I'll do darkness, and then I'll do the Spirit of God. In our last video, I did the water, and I just want to do a couple more scriptures on water, and then I'll go into darkness, and then I'll do another separate video on the Spirit of God. So, last video, water, I was making a case to show that water represents, chaos, disorder, death. Because that's, at the end of the day, that's what death is. It's things returning to their chaotic form, right? Their disordered or disorganized form. And I showed you a bunch of scriptures in the Old and New Testament about that. And I want to share a scripture from the Doctrine and Covenants that continues that theme. And you can see here in Doctrine and Covenants section 128, verse 12, it says, the ordinance, starting here in the second line, right there, the ordinance of baptism by water, to be immersed therein in order to answer to the likeness of the dead, that one principle might accord with the other. To be immersed in the water and come forth out of the water is in the likeness of the resurrection of the dead and coming forth out of their graves. Okay. Verse 13, consequently, the baptismal font was instituted as a similitude of the grave and was commanded to be in a place underneath where the living are wont to assemble, to show forth the living and the dead, and that all things may have their likeness, and that they may accord one with another. Okay, so Joseph Smith is saying here in this section is that the baptismal font in the temple, where we would do baptisms for the dead, has to be lower than everything else because it represents the grave. It has to be at the bottom of the temple. In most temples, that's how it works. If you notice in the Gilbert Temple, for example, you go down, 3 flights of stairs or something, or 2, to get down, to where the temple is. And it is, sorry, not the temple, the baptismal font. And the baptismal font represents the grave. The water is the chaos, right? And so when you're being baptized, you're going down into the grave and you're disintegrating back into the chaotic element from which you were made. And then the person who's baptizing you represents Jesus Christ, resurrects you, pulls you up out of the water, and brings you back into newness and fullness of life, right? That's the symbolism. So you can see, I went through a bunch of scriptures in the New Testament and the Old Testament that showed that this was kind of the basic symbolism of water. Not all the time, but a lot of times in the scriptures, okay? And that here we see it in the Doctrine and Covenants. All right, there's one more I want to show you in the Psalms that I think is really great. And as I'm going there, I'll just mention, think about like the stories of Jesus walking on the water or calming the storms. Like those miracles should mean something more now, because he's it's a sign or a symbol. Like it would have symbolic value. The miracle, I mean, in and of itself, just calming a storm or walking on water would be like mind-boggling, blowing, right? But it also symbolically shows like Jesus Christ has power over death and chaos and disorder. The miracle isn't just to have a miracle; it also teaches, it testifies of Christ, and the way it testifies is that he has that power over death and disorder and disorganization, over chaos. All right, so Psalm 69 says, "Save me, O God, for the waters are come in unto my soul." Okay, so the psalmist here is asking for God to save him because waters, which symbolizes death and chaos and disorder, have come into his soul. Like he feels the chaos inside of him. He feels the disorder. He feels that he's drowning, that he's losing himself to the chaos inside of him. Okay. He says in verse 2, "I sink deep in mire where there's no standing. I am come into deep waters where the floods overflow me. I am weary of my crying. My throat is dried. Mine eyes fail while I wait for my God." So it's this really powerful image that shows, like, again, this idea that water, you can't live in it, right? It's chaos. You can't stand in it. You can't build a house on it, In fact, that's where I'm convinced that's, when Jesus says the wise man built his house on a rock and the foolish man built his house on the sand, and then the rains come. See, the rains are the chaos that come and they destroy the man's house that's built on sand, whereas the man who builds his house on a rock is protected from the chaos, right? So you see, like, that symbol even carries over into that parable, the symbolism of water being chaotic. Now, all of these scriptures I've been sharing indicate that the waters might be negative, but you shouldn't take it that way. It's just, chaos is not good or bad. It's just chaotic, right? You and I, the reason why it's bad from a human perspective is because we can't live in it. It's not livable. You and I would drown in it. But chaos also has a ton of potential, right? So it has all that downside because we can't live in it and we would drown in it. It's a great metaphor and symbol for, what trials and tribulations are. It's just like chaos unleashed in the world, right? Or in our souls. And we struggle with it. But it also is potential. Like, chaos can be shaped and formed into something glorious, which is what Genesis 1 tells the story of. So it has all this potential in it. And I wanted to share, I'll share that in a minute. So let me just wrap up the symbolism of water then, right? For our purposes right now, it's a great symbol of chaos and death and disorganization, but also potential. Okay, and now we'll show you this scripture. Okay, so two scriptures and a quote. So I've made a big deal that in Abraham 3, God will go down, for there is space there, and he will take of these materials. Okay, I've made a big deal that in our doctrine, in the doctrine of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that the water has always existed. The water symbolizes the chaotic elements, right? But the chaotic elements have always existed, that they weren't poofed into existence by God. And so that's called creation ex materia, or creation out of matter. And the other way you can look at it is creation out of nothing, that God poofed the matter into existence, and then so it didn't always exist. It started to exist at a certain point in time when God brought it into being. Now, we don't agree with that doctrine, but most of the rest of Christianity does. And they see our belief in the rest of Christianity sees our belief in this doctrine of creation out of matter as blasphemous. Okay, and I'm going to explain that here on this slide I made. But I want to share why I don't think it is blasphemous, okay, and why I actually think it exalts the honor of God, and is absolutely necessary for defending the honor of God. Okay, so we have this doctrine here, like it says in Abraham 3, God's going to go down and take of the materials, the stuff that's already there, and those materials, as I've been saying in Genesis 1 verse 2, are symbolized by the waters, and he'll make an earth where on these may dwell, right? And D&C 93 tells us that intelligence, or the light of truth, was not created or made, neither indeed can be. So you and I are made out of this stuff called intelligence, and it was not created, and it was not made. It can't be made. And what I think that means is God didn't poof it into existence, and he also can't combine other things to create intelligence. Like intelligence is like a base element, okay, that has always existed. And then also D&C 93 tells us in verse 33 that the elements are also eternal, okay, that they have always existed. And Joseph Smith taught this also in the King Follett Discourse and in other places. He says the word create came from the word bara, that's the Hebrew word bara, which does not mean to create out of nothing. It means to organize, the same as a man would organize materials and build a ship. Hence, we infer that God had materials to organize the world out of chaos, chaotic matter, which is element, and in which dwells all the glory. Element had no existence from the time element had an existence from the time he had. The pure principles of element are principles which can never be destroyed. They may be organized and reorganized, but not destroyed. They had no beginning and can have no end. So I'm sharing these scriptures with you to point out, like, one of the characteristics of this chaotic water that we're reading about in Genesis is that it's always existed, okay? And that it is chaotic and it can lead to us drowning, like it's not livable. But at the same time, it also has a positive element to it, right? See, Joseph says, in it dwells all the glory, meaning it's the stuff that God's going to make all the good stuff out of, right? Like, this is his work and his glory to bring to pass the immortality and eternal life of man, and he's going to do this through the matter. He's going to use this matter to exalt us and to bless us. And so it, in the hands of God, the matter becomes a blessing. And I'll get more into that as I talk about darkness and the Spirit of God. But I just wanted to point that out in the scripture here. Now, one of the reasons why it matters, now I'll show you over here on this side. Here's an example from the Westminster Confession of Faith, where it says that God created out of nothing, right? In the beginning, he created or made of nothing the world and all things therein. And, why does this matter? There's actually a couple reasons why it matters. And one of them is that is tied to over here to D&C 93, is that it's hard to imagine that human beings have real agency if God poofed us into being, poofed all of the stuff we're made out of into being. Like, he did create us. He organized us. He organized. That's what bara, create, means, is to organize. So he organized us, but there was stuff he organized us out of. And it's hard, philosophers have a hard time understanding how a human being can have real agency if God poofed all of us into being, because then what you are is just whatever God made you to be. See, like if you were, and somebody would say, well, what, maybe God could create us to have agency. But see, the agency you would have would be the agency that God designed. And so if you are really bad at making good choices, you could say it's God's fault because he poorly designed your agency. If you're really good at making choices, you would say it's God's, glory be to God, right? Because he designed you to make good choices. But at the end of the day, like, the reason why choices are made is because of the way God designed your agency, if he's the one that poofed it into existence, right? And so that's like the dilemma, one of the dilemmas that comes about because of this. If you believe in creation out of nothing, if you believe in creation out of matter, then that problem is overcome, because the matter, the stuff that God is making us out of, may have like the capacity of agency built within it already. It might be one of its properties. And that's actually what D&C 93, I think, is saying, is that intelligence, like the ability to like think and make choices, or the light of truth, which is another way of saying that, right? The ability to like see light and understand truth was not created or made, neither indeed can be. Like, so that potential, that capacity, it exists in some forms of matter, and that's the stuff that God made us out of, is what D&C 93 is suggesting, okay? And what that means then is that God didn't wholly design your agency. Now, he might condition it in certain ways because of the way he organizes us, or because of the environment he places us in, which we're going to talk about in the creation story. It does condition our agency, but it may not be the full root cause of it. And so therefore, like, you and I might truly be responsible for our choices, in other words, is what this D&C 93 is saying. And meaning, if I make a bad choice, it's my fault, not God's. And if it make a good choice, well, I will say it's still God's. Glory be to God, because as we'll see in the creation story, we're only able to make good choices because God helps us. We're not really good at making good choices. But the bad choices aren't because of God's bad design, is because that's what this doctrine gets at, basically. And now another thing is not just our agency, but like the nature of matter in general, okay? So, like if God could create a world that doesn't have any evil in it, then why didn't he do that, right? And most people would say, well, he had to create a world with evil in it so that we could grow and progress. And, because you need opposition. And we believe that principle. Like every Christian and, believes that. Members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints do too. But the doctrine of creation out of nothing means that God potentially could have done it without. He could have held us. Why didn't he just make us fully grown to begin with? Like, why do we have to progress and grow and learn these lessons? If he can do whatever he wants, just make us fully formed with having learned all the lessons without having to go through them. And you would say, well, that's not possible. Well, why? Why isn't it possible? If God can do everything, then he should be able to do that. He should be able to make it so we learn the lessons without having to go through the lessons, right? Make it so that we have wisdom without failing, make it so that we learn how to be obedient without first being terribly sinful and, learning through the hard way, right? Like, why can't we just skip all the lessons and learn the lesson if God can do anything? That's the question, right? Why can't we skip all the pain and suffering that just seem to be random, right? That don't, sometimes there's too much evil. Like, do we really need, and couldn't we, sometimes people will say, couldn't we just learn the lesson without so much evil? Like, do we really need little children to die of cancer? Do we really need like all the sexual assault that's in the world? Do we really need all of that awful ugliness that exists in order for us to learn the lessons that we need to learn? So maybe there was too much evil, right? Do we need like mass destruction of hurricanes and all that stuff, and tornadoes and earthquakes and mass, like the natural events that harm us and hurt us, that we would call part of the problem of evil and suffering? So that question comes up, and according to our doctrine, so B.H. Roberts was a 70 in our church, and he said, this is how he described it. Now, see, if you believe in creation out of nothing, the reason why the doctrine of creation out of nothing came into being was because early Christians, it came into being around the 2nd or 3rd century after Christ's birth, in 2nd or 3rd century AD. And the reason why it came into being is because early Christians were trying to protect the honor of God, right? They were trying to say, like, hey, look, God is so great, so wonderful, so marvelous, like he can do anything. And so therefore you should put your trust in him. And that on its surface level, it makes a lot of sense, right? And so then when Latter-day Saints come along and say, no, God's creates out of matter, other Christians say that's blasphemous because you're putting limits on God. You're saying there's certain things he can't do, because if matter always existed as long as he did, then he didn't decide what the properties of that matter is. Those are like givens in the universe or in the nature of things that he has to account for, and so in that sense, that limits or conditions God's power, what he can do. And I get that objection, I totally do. But the reason why I framed up that whole thing called the problem of evil, like, do we really have agency? Can we really be accountable for our own choices? You know, why is there evil in the world? Why is there so much evil in the world? Is it all really necessary for us to learn? You know, all of those questions are called, you know, are under the umbrella of a thing called like the problem of evil. And there's different versions of the problem of evil, but anyway, that's what it's called, right? It's like, why do bad things happen, basically? And we're able to, you know, the doctrine of creation out of matter is one of the doctrines that helps to answer that. It's not the only one, but it's an important one. And basically it says, as B.H. Roberts says here, all that may or can be done by power conditioned by other eternal existences, duration, space, matter, truth, justice, God can do. But even he may not act out of harmony with the other eternal existences which condition or limit even him. So what B.H. Roberts is saying is that there are other eternal things. And because they are also eternal, God can do whatever reality allows him to do, but there are some things he can't do. And so he's all powerful in the sense that all power that is possible is his, but there are some things he can't do. And this creation story, what I'm suggesting is the elements condition what he's able to do. And what I was getting at was, well, here, let me read the next paragraph from B.H. Roberts. So why should he, God, create by mere act of volition beings such as men are, not only capable of, but prone to moral evil, which leaves responsibility for moral evil with God? So like, if God could poof us in, he's the one that poofed us into existence, what B.H. Roberts is saying is, why did he make us capable of and even prone to moral evil? Why not just make us not capable of evil, right? And what these doctrines about eternal matter and eternal intelligence and stuff says is that there's characteristics or property in the matter itself that's always been around that conditions or limits what God can do. And so when it comes to that water, the elements that God is going to create the earth out of, it has certain properties. And I think I mentioned this in the last video, but I'm going to say it now. If you read the story, the properties that the matter has is that, and it symbolizes water, right? Water takes the shape you give it. Water reflects back to you like the image that you present to it. So it's a form, like the properties themselves have like a form of justice, you could say, built into them, right? Like it's just a part of their nature that they reflect back to you what you present, or they take the shape you give it, right? So basically that's what matter does, is it in the story, God speaks and it takes the shape that he gives it, right? And that's wonderful for God, because God is wholly good, you see, and that's why we don't think that the matter limits him, is because he's so. This is how I would argue that this actually saves, doesn't lessen God, is that because God is so good, because he's so loving, he's so pure, because he is actually the only good being, then the chaos reflects that back to him. It reflects goodness back to him. And that's what is said multiple times in the creation story. Like, he does something and it says it is good, right? The creation story. So like the matter takes the shape he gives it, and God gives it the shape of life, let's say, the shape that enables human beings to prosper and have a bountiful life with joy. And that's because God is so good. But you and I aren't very good at shaping matter. Like the story goes on to talk about when you and I make choices, that we actually start to change the shape of the chaos, the matter that's around us too. And because we're not very good, we start to build prisons for ourselves. The reality that we create through our choices, our actions, our words, our thoughts, our deeds, end up being a prison. So because again, justice is just woven into the nature of the chaos of the matter. And you see this in the story of the fall, where Adam and Eve, like the garden spontaneously brings forth fruit on day 3 of the creation story, right? Whatever God planted into the earth produces that fruit. It just does it because that's its nature. That's like justice, you could say, is woven into the fabric of the elements. And God, when God organizes it, it multiplies. It's not just like a one for one justice thing. It's like God enables the matter to multiply its awesomeness, right? To multiply its fruit, to multiply the seed of women. That's when God blesses these things, he increases its capacity to produce things. Okay, that's part of the story of creation too. But you and I don't do that, and that's the story of the fall. And when Adam and Eve, when they act and do what they do, the earth reflects back to them thorns and thistles. Okay, like their actions produce not life but death, right? So that's the dilemma. Is that for us at least, that's the dilemma. Is that the matter has always existed, and and because we're not very good at making choices, it becomes our prison. But for God, it's not a prison because he's so good at making choices. So you see, the God of the restoration is all powerful because he's all good. Whereas the God of traditional Christianity is all powerful just because he's all powerful. He can do whatever he wants. And the problem with that is that then God is responsible for all the evil in the world. And you and I don't really have agency. And it makes God kind of an arbitrary person. And anyone he sets this whole system up, and then according to traditional Christianity, most people will go to hell. So God is responsible for poofing people into existence and then sending them to hell. Like that's ultimately the outcome of that. And that's why it's troublesome, right? That's why I think Heavenly Father and Jesus wanted to restore the true doctrine about God to Joseph Smith, was because they want the world to know that they're not like that that's not their true nature, that they don't set people up to fail, to go to hell, and they don't set people up for their agency to be misused. Okay, that what they are actually are heroes. There are already principles that are just exist in the nature of reality, and those principles would condemn you and I, but God comes along to save us, and that's the story in the book of Abraham. It says that God came down among all the intelligences that existed and instituted laws to help them progress. So like he had to come down. That's important in the story. It says come down because I think he literally was coming down from wherever he was, but it also shows symbolically like he had to come down to our level because we weren't, whatever we were at that point in time, we weren't capable of, getting the fullness of joy and happiness out of existence, out of reality. And he was able to facilitate that because he's so good. Okay. So that's the story of water. All right. And I want to quickly talk about darkness, because that's another, let me come back to my little pre-creation thing here. There's water, right? And there's darkness and the Spirit of God. So when it comes to darkness, there was darkness upon the face of the deep, right? And what is the darkness, right? So darkness, just in its basic sense, is the absence of light. Okay, so if God is not present there, then it would be dark, right? Because God is light, and God is the source of light, of all light. This is what the scriptures say in the Bible and the Doctrine and Covenants and other places. That Joseph Smith even said this, that God the Father and Jesus Christ are the source of all light in the universe. Like, so the sunlight, this is actually an important concept. The sunlight is a version of God's light. Like, you and I think of it as not God's light, because that's not what we learn in our science classes and stuff. But we should think of it like the creation story, as I walk through it, especially when we get into the book of Abraham. It shows that we should think of the sunlight as a more like crude form of the light that proceeds forth from the presence of God to fill the immensity of space. And And so you and I are like basking in God's glory and light every day of our lives. Okay. Yes, it's being mediated to us through the sun, but the sun is shining because God shines on the sun, you could say. Okay. And so the idea of darkness is that it's the absence of God. In fact, that's the point of the darkness and the water in the pre-creation state, is that there's darkness on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God is also hovering there. The Spirit of God is there. God's presence is always there. It's everywhere. But it hasn't fully engaged yet with the water or the darkness, and therefore the water and the darkness remain. Chaos remains and darkness remains. If God's Spirit had fully engaged, then the water ceases to be chaos and water. It would turn into something that is productive and bountiful, and the darkness would disappear. Okay, so anyway, so the darkness is that, and then another way to think of darkness is from the vision of the tree of life, where Nephi is told that the mists of darkness are the temptations of the devil, right? And that's actually probably the image that is being shown to us in the creation story, is that there's darkness on the face of the deep. So if there's like this vast ocean out there, the image is like an ocean, and then there's like darkness over it, the darkness would be mists, right? It'd be like a cloud of darkness over the deep. And so it is like the mists of darkness. And there is actually an ancient Christian tradition that suggests that that's what the darkness is referring to in Genesis 1 verse 2, is that it was after God kicked Satan and his angels out of heaven for their rebellion, he cast them down, onto the deep, and that's where they were. And that's what the darkness is like those bad guys hanging out there, right? And there's even this little, in Moses chapter 2, I think it is, or 3, there's this interesting statement. It says Moses 2, verse 2, and it says, "And the earth was without form and void, and I," this is Jehovah, "caused darkness to come upon the face of the deep." So in the Genesis account, it doesn't say that God caused it. It just says it was there. But in the Moses account, it says that God caused the darkness to come upon the face of the deep. And so it kind of jives with that Christian idea, that old Christian tradition, that maybe that's what it is God was casting the devil and his angels out of heaven and caused them to come upon the face of the deep. There's this quote I want to share with you guys from Joseph Smith. And it says that Joseph said that before the foundation of the earth in the Grand Council, that the spirits of all men were subject to oppression. And the express purpose of God in giving it a tabernacle was to arm it against the power of darkness. So, and then it says the design of God, and this comes from a guy, his name is Thomas McIntyre. He's like a early member of the church who was writing down a sermon that Joseph Smith gave in his journal, okay? It says, the design of God before the foundation of the world was that we should take tabernacles, that through faithfulness we should overcome and thereby obtain a resurrection from the dead. In this wise, obtain glory, honor, and power and dominion, for this thing is needful, inasmuch as the spirits in the eternal world glory in bringing other spirits in subjection unto them, striving continually for the mastery. When Lucifer was hurled from heaven, the decree was that he should not obtain a tabernacle, not those that were with him, but go abroad upon the earth exposed to the anger of the elements, naked and bare. And so this quote is really interesting because it suggests that, that life before the creation, there are at least aspects of that life that were subject to oppression, and that there are these wandering spirits out there that have they have a bad intention for us. They want to bring us into subjection and have mastery over us. And that part of God's purpose in creating this life was to give us a body so we would have mastery over those spirits, right? That they wouldn't, that the power of darkness would not have control over us. And so this quote like fits really well with this idea that the darkness on the face of the deep is the devil and his angels, or like the absence of light, or the presence of evil, like lurking over the water, right? and and that, there's this, I love this last sentence where it says that when Lucifer was hurled from heaven, his punishment basically was to go abroad upon the earth, exposed to the anger of the elements, naked and bare. So I just read all those scriptures about water and how they're, it's like this wonderful metaphor for like trials and tribulations, and like that chaos, even though it has all this potential, because of our weakness, our inability to master chaos, it ends up being like an affliction for us, right? It's like you and I would be naked and bare before those elements too, and it would destroy us, like the psalmist who says he would sink in the mire and drown, right? And so here you have this idea that Lucifer and his crew have been, cast down upon the face of the deep, and they're exposed naked and bare to the chaos themselves, right? So that's maybe the image that's an image, I should say, that we can read into the story, right? And just, like, there's many ways to read the creation story, and this is an account I'm giving you guys, like a version, that I've pieced together by piecing together a bunch of different ideas. This is truly Cameron LeDuc ideas, right? But I just want to share with you there's a way of reading this where it turns the story turns into a testimony of Jesus Christ, basically. Because what I'm basically saying is that before Jesus Christ interacts with the pre-creation state, it is a tough environment. It's an environment that you could characterize as death and sin, right? The darkness could symbolize sin, and the water can symbolize death. Now, that's the most negative way of talking about them. A more positive way is like chaos has potential, it can become a good thing, but it still is chaos. It's still something you and I can't handle or control or manage on our own. And darkness is also something that's not good. Like, we don't do well. We don't dwell well in darkness. And so, but, in either event, our lives are filled, you could say our lives are filled with death and sin, or you could say our lives are filled with chaos and darkness. And in either way, you need Jesus Christ, right? So the story of creation, what I'm getting at, is the same story that all of the scriptures are talking about, which is the world, the universe, reality, whatever you want to call it, is filled with chaos and darkness, with death and sin. And the only solution to that problem is Jesus Christ, who comes and brings the Spirit of God with him. He baptizes with fire, right? That's what's being foreshadowed in verse 2 of Genesis chapter 1. And so I'm going to end this Marco Polo, and I'll come back and talk more about the Spirit of God, but you can kind of see the direction I'm going to go with the discussion about the Spirit of God. All right. I think that's enough for now. So I'll stop and come back later.